Chapter 1. Introduction. Japan in the early 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan was at a crossroads. After centuries of relative isolation during the Edo period, the Meiji Restoration in 1868 had ushered in a period of radical modernization and opening up to the Western world. In just a few decades, Japan transformed itself from a feudal state into an emerging industrial nation. Tram lines, railways, modern schools, and a growing industry shaped the cities. But this progress went hand in hand with militarism. The army and navy grew into central power factors, and the political elite saw expansion and military strength as the key to securing national interests. Politically, Japan was a constitutional monarchy at the time, but power was in the hands of the military and the emperor, Hirohito. Parliamentary democracy was weak, and the generals and admiralty dominated political decisions. This structure laid the foundation for the later military dictatorship that would lead Japan into World War II. The economic situation was ambivalent. Japan had made considerable industrial progress in the first decades of the 20th century, especially in textile production, heavy industry, and shipbuilding. At the same time, the country was heavily dependent on imports of raw materials, especially oil, iron, and rubber, which it had to obtain from colonized or friendly states. This dependence drove the military to plan expansions in Asia to guarantee resources and strategic security. Socially, Japan was characterized by a mixture of traditional values and rapid change. The Shinto religion and the cult of the emperor fostered nationalism and loyalty, while education, Western science, and modern ideas gained increasing influence. This field of tension between tradition and modernity, between militarism and economic development, shaped Japanese society and prepared the country for the challenges of the 20th century. At the international level, Japan began to establish itself as a regional power. As early as 1895, it had defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War and taken control of Taiwan. In 1904 to 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, a sensation for the world powers and proof that an Asian country could challenge Western powers militarily. These victories strengthened Japan's self-confidence, but they also created expectations, both internally and among the Western powers, that Japan was an equal player on the international stage. This early phase of the 20th century thus laid the foundations for the later events of World War II, a nation-state with a modern military, economic ambition, and a strong nationalism that saw expansion and conflict as a means of securing resources and prestige. At the same time, there was a deep tension between Western influences and the traditional order, which favored political radicalization and militarization. In the next chapter, we will look at the Meiji Restoration and its aftermath, the modernization of Japan, the centralization of power, and the emergence of the militaristic thinking that formed the basis of the war policies of the 1930s and 40s. Chapter 2. The Meiji Restoration and its consequences. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked a turning point in Japan's history. After centuries of isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan opened up to the world and began a profound process of modernization. The aim was to secure national sovereignty, build economic strength, and catch up politically and militarily with the major Western powers. This period shaped Japan's political, social, and military thinking for the early 20th century, and thus also the foundations for its role in the Second World War. Politically, traditional feudal structures were abolished, and the emperor was once again declared the central figure of the state. Although the imperial office initially remained rather symbolic, in practice the power of a narrow circle of advisors, military leaders, and bureaucrats who drove modernization grew. The government introduced constitutions, ministries, and a parliament, but real control over political decisions remained with military and conservative forces. This mixture of modern state apparatus and authoritarian control would later be decisive when military leaders dominated Japan's direction of war. Economically, Japan relied on industrialization, railways, heavy industry, and military production. The government specifically promoted factories, the manufacture of weapons, shipbuilding, and the expansion of the steel industry. At the same time, agrarian reforms were carried out in order to integrate the peasantry more efficiently into the national economy. These measures laid the foundation for a powerful war economy, which became crucial in the 1930s and 1940s as Japan prepared for expansion and war. Japan changed profoundly socially. The education system was modernized, Western sciences were introduced, and the emperor cult was strengthened as a unifying national symbol. Shintoism and nationalism merged into an ideology that propagated loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice. These values were later used for war propaganda to mobilize the population and legitimize total war. Militarily, the Meiji Restoration relied on a strong, centralized army and navy. Western military technologies and strategies were adopted, training and discipline intensified. Japan developed a navy capable of securing control of sea routes, a decisive factor for its later expansion in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Military modernization went hand in hand with a political ideology that saw expansion and warfare as legitimate and necessary. The foreign policy of the Meiji period clearly showed that Japan saw itself as an emerging regional power. After the victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the Japanese proved that they could not only compete militarily, but also successfully implement imperialist ambitions. These victories strengthened self-confidence and contributed to the radicalization of nationalist circles. Many military leaders and politicians now saw Japan as the natural leader country in East Asia, paving the way for aggressive expansions in the 1930s. In summary, the Meiji Restoration laid the crucial foundations for Japan's role in World War II. A centralized, modernized state, an economic industrial base, a strong military, and a society characterized by nationalism, loyalty to the emperor, and willingness to make sacrifices. These factors later merged into an ideology that presented expansion, war, and total mobilization as a national imperative. In the next chapter, we will look at Japan in World War I, how the country took advantage of global conflicts, strengthened its economic position, and gained international recognition, which in turn paved the way for its military and political expansion. Chapter 3: Japan and the First World War. World War I, 1914 to 1918, represented a crucial opportunity for Japan to consolidate its international position and pursue territorial ambitions. Although Japan officially fought on the side of the Allies, its participation in the European theaters of war remained limited. Rather, the focus was on regional expansion, economic strengthening, and the expansion of spheres of influence in East Asia. Japan entered the war against the German Empire in 1914 after Germany declared war on Great Britain. Since Japan was allied with Britain in the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, Japan declared war on Germany. Japan's military focus was initially on the German colonies in East Asia and the Pacific, especially on the Bismarck Archipelago region, German New Guinea, and Kiao Bay in China. In the first months of the war, Japan quickly conquered these territories, thereby strengthening its territorial influence in the region. The siege of Tsingtao, Kiao Bay, in November 1914 was a central military success. Japanese troops, supported by British Marines, captured the German colony after weeks of intense fighting. Control of these port facilities and coastal regions gave Japan strategic advantages. It could monitor trade in the region, expand its naval base, and expand its presence in mainland China. But the war was not only militarily important, but above all economically. While Europe's industries were heavily burdened by the war, Japan benefited enormously. Exports of textiles, machinery, and armaments to Asia and allied countries rose drastically. Japanese companies expanded, new industries emerged, and the country was able to massively expand its economic infrastructure. The First World War thus prepared the basis for the later war economy of the 1930s and 1940s. Politically, Japan gained international recognition. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, Japan received, among other things, confirmation of its control over former German colonies in China and the Pacific. At the same time, Japan was able to push through its demands for recognition as an equal world power, although Western powers were often reluctant to accept this position. This newly acquired prestige strengthened the self-confidence of the Japanese government and military, and contributed to the development of a more aggressive expansionist policy in East Asia. Socially, Japan benefited from modernization, which was accelerated by the war. Prosperity grew, urbanization and industrialization picked up speed, and many new educational institutions were created. At the same time, however, tensions also formed. Rapid economic development led to social inequalities, and radical ultranationalist circles began to propagate the military as a pioneer of national interests. The experiences of World War I also influenced Japan's military strategy. The military realized that rapid, targeted operations combined with economic strength could be the basis for regional dominance. These lessons were further perfected in the decades that followed, playing a crucial role in operations in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific during World War II. In summary, the First World War was a catalyst for Japan. Militarily, the country was able to assert its regional ambitions, expand economically, and politically act as an equal world power. The experiences and successes of this period laid the foundation for the aggressive expansionist policy that Japan was to pursue in the 1930s and 1940s, and which ultimately led to the conflict of the Second World War. In the next chapter, we will look at the interwar period and the increasing militarization of Japan, a period in which political instability, economic pressure, and nationalistic ideologies set the course for the war policy of the 1930s.
Chapter 4. Interwar Period and Expansion. The period between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II was a period of intense political, economic, and military transformation for Japan. While the country was recognized as a victorious power at the international level, domestic political tensions, economic challenges, and the influence of the military grew. These years laid the foundation for Japan's aggressive expansionist policy in the 1930s and 1940s. Politically, Japan was still formally a constitutional monarchy in the 1920s, but in practice, power increasingly shifted to the generals and naval leadership. The parliament, the so-called Diet, had only limited powers. Military leaders took advantage of this weakness to advance their agenda, especially territorial expansion and the imposition of ultra-nationalist ideologies. Heads of government who opposed military interests were often put under pressure or even dismissed. Internationally, Japan sought recognition as an equal great power during this time. Participation in the League of Nations and the signing of the Treaty of Washington in 1922, which limited naval strengths, were attempts to consolidate the international position. But these agreements were increasingly criticized by nationalist circles in Japan as a restriction of sovereignty. Public opinion began to radicalize. Expansion, control over raw materials, and military strength were presented as a national duty. Economically, Japan suffered from the consequences of the Great Depression of 1929, with exports collapsing, unemployment and social tensions increasing. The economic hardship increased support for the military leadership, which propagated expansion as a solution. Control over resources in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific was supposed to secure Japan's industrial base. This idea was widely accepted by the political and military elite. Militarily, the interwar period was characterized by modernization, strategic planning, and increasing influence on politics. The Imperial Army and Navy developed plans for large-scale operations in East Asia. Manchuria was targeted as the first stage of expansion, a strategically and economically important region rich in coal, iron, and agricultural resources. Japanese military officials saw control of these areas as necessary for national security and economic stability. The political ideology of the time combined nationalism, militarism, and expansionism. Terms such as Hokushinran, Northern Expansion Policy, and Nanshinran, Southern Expansion Policy, were discussed to determine the direction of imperial ambitions. In addition, propaganda at home increased. Schools, newspapers, and official institutions promoted loyalty to the emperor, the willingness to sacrifice for the nation, and Japan's superiority over other Asian peoples. As early as 1931, the consequence of this policy became apparent with the invasion of Manchuria. Under the pretext of security interests, Japanese troops occupied the region, installed a puppet state, Manchukuo, and demonstrated that Japan was willing to use force to achieve its geopolitical goals. This action was criticized internationally, but Japan ignored the sanctions of the League of Nations, clear evidence that the country relied on military strength to circumvent international restrictions. In summary, the interwar period was a period of radicalization and consolidation of imperial ambitions for Japan. Economic hardship, political instability, and an overpowering military influence led to expansion being presented as the only alternative strategy. The military shaped the political direction, economic interests were linked to nationalist ideology, and the stage was set for World War II. In the next chapter, we'll take a closer look at the war against China, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and plunged the region into years of violence and destruction.
Chapter 5. Japan and China, the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937, marked the beginning of a long and brutal period for Japan and China, closely linked to the later events of World War II in the Pacific. For Japan, this war was both a strategic and an ideological step, securing economic resources, consolidating imperial control, and enforcing the idea of a nationalist Greater Japan. Tensions between Japan and China had already built up in the 1920s. Japan viewed China as a source of strategic and economic resources, especially coal, iron, agricultural land, and important ports. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo had shown that Japan was willing to use force to achieve its goals. But the real extent of the expansion did not begin until 1937, after the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident, an incident near Beijing that was used by the Japanese military as a pretext to justify the full-scale invasion of China. Japanese troops quickly invaded northern China, using state-of-the-art military technologies and strategic surprises to weaken the Chinese national government under Chiang Kai-shek. Major cities such as Shanghai, Nanjing, and Wuhan became central battlefields. The Nanjing Massacre in 1937 in particular showed the brutality of the conflict. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were killed, systematically looted, and raped. This event made international headlines and left behind deep mistrust between China and Japan, which continues to have an effect today. Militarily, Japan relied on superior organization, modern armament, and fast mobility. Airstrikes, artillery, and tanks were targeted, while the Chinese military was often under-coordinated, poorly equipped, and fragmented. Japanese commanders also used psychological warfare and propaganda to weaken the morale of the Chinese population. At the same time, the war was costly. Despite military superiority, many battles dragged on for years, which enormously increased the need for resources and soldiers. The Japanese occupation policy was brutal and efficient at the same time. Cities were controlled, resistance was suppressed with a heavy hand, and resources were systematically exploited. At the same time, Japan tried to install collaborating governments that would facilitate control over the population. This approach showed a mixture of military toughness and pragmatic administration, which was intended to secure the occupation in the long term. But the war in China was not an easy victory. Guerrilla fighting, acts of sabotage, and popular resistance swept through the entire occupied territories. The Chinese government increasingly resorted to a long war of attrition, while Japan struggled with logistical problems. Supply lines became longer, the number of troops had to be continuously increased, and the economic burden increased. International reactions to Japanese expansion were ambivalent. Western powers such as the USA and Great Britain condemned the violence in China, but direct military intervention initially failed to materialize. Japan used this restraint to further consolidate its position in China and advance its political agenda. In summary, the Second Sino-Japanese War was a central conflict that manifested Japan's role as a rising great power in East Asia. He showed the combination of military strength, strategic calculation, and ideological justification that would later determine the war in the Pacific. At the same time, it revealed the limits of expansion. The resistance of the population, the logistical challenges, and the moral costs were enormous. In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at Japan's domestic politics and militarization, how generals, ultranationalist ideologies, and the emperor determined the political direction and determined the path to World War II.
Chapter 6. Domestic Policy and Military Dictatorship. The 1930s marked a pivotal period in Japanese domestic politics.
paving the way for aggressive expansion in China and eventually into the Pacific. Japan increasingly developed into a military dictatorship during this period, in which the political system remained formally a constitutional monarchy, but the real power lay with the generals and the imperial army. This shift in power was the result of a combination of political instability, economic hardship, ultra-nationalist ideology, and the growing influence of the military. The political institutions that had been introduced after the Meiji Restoration had been formally preserved: a parliament, cabinets, and a constitution. But the generals used their strategic position and the loyalty of the imperial family to dominate the government's decisions. Prime ministers were often deposed or forced to implement military policies, especially when it came to expansion or preparations for war. Democratic processes were increasingly a facade, while the military determined Japan's actual direction. A central element of this phase was the rise of ultra-nationalist organizations. Secret societies, student groups, and militarist think tanks propagated the idea that Japan was on a divine mission and that its leadership role in East Asia was legitimized by expansion and war. Terms such as Hakko Ichiyu, the union of all under heaven, became ideological guiding principles that justified the actions of the government and the military. This ideology combined loyalty to the emperor with a willingness to make sacrifices and the claim to regional dominance. Militarization was supported economically. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Japan hard. Exports collapsed, unemployment rose, and social tensions increased. The military offered a solution. Expansion into China and Southeast Asia was to secure resources and at the same time reduce economic pressure. The state invested specifically in the arms industry, infrastructure for military operations, and the training of officers. These measures made Japan ready for war and further strengthened the military's influence on political decisions. The role of Emperor Hirohito was complex. Formally, he was the symbol of the nation and the highest authority, but the generals used his prestige to legitimize their agenda. Hirohito was increasingly stylized as a deity, a figure whose instructions could not be questioned. This religious ideological dimension strengthened the power of the military leadership and created an almost sacred loyalty within the army, navy, and administration. Domestic politics was also characterized by violence against opponents. Politicians, intellectuals, and civil servants who spoke out against militarization were intimidated, murdered, or put under pressure. The so-called five-pillar policy combined political control, military rule, economic mobilization, ideological propaganda, and social surveillance. It formed the basis for a society in which resistance was almost impossible, and in the preparation for war was considered a national duty. At the same time, the military strengthened control over education and the media. School curricula and newspapers were used to spread nationalism, loyalty to the emperor, and enemy images against China, the USA, and Western colonial powers. The population was prepared to make sacrifices in the event of war, and the youth were ideologically shaped early on in cadre schools and military programs. In summary, Japan's domestic politics in the 1930s were characterized by a de facto military dictatorship, in which political institutions were formally preserved but practically disempowered. Ultramilitarism, ideological indoctrination, and economic mobilization formed the basis for the aggressive foreign policy that led to the later Second World War. This structure not only made Japan ready for war, but also prepared the entire society for total mobilization and sacrifice. In the next chapter, we will look at economic and social mobilization in detail, how industry, propaganda, and society were prepared for all-out war. Chapter 7: Economic and Social Mobilization. In the 1930s and early 1940s, Japan systematically prepared for all-out war. Economic and social mobilization was a central element that enabled the country not only to maintain its army and navy, but also to involve the entire population in the war process. This happened on several levels: industrial conversion, work organization, propaganda, and social control. Industry and production were the focus of the preparations. The Japanese government invested heavily in heavy industry, arms production, and infrastructure. Factories that previously produced civilian goods were converted to weapons, tanks, ammunition, aircraft, and warships. Large companies such as Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Nissan were closely linked to military projects. These companies received government contracts, loans, and resources to ensure production for the war. At the same time, workers were systematically mobilized. Men were drafted into the Army and Navy, women worked in factories and supported the war economy, while students and young people were prepared for military tasks in training camps. Sourcing raw materials was another key challenge. Japan was rich in human capital but poor in strategic resources such as oil, rubber, iron ore, and metals. Dependence on imports led to a clear goal: to expand into China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific to secure these resources. The Japanese government established a complex system for controlling imports, supplies, and logistics, which worked even before the war began and later facilitated the occupation of Southeast Asian countries. The mobilization was not only economic but also ideological. Propaganda played a central role. Media, education, films, posters, and newspapers were used to promote nationalism, loyalty to the emperor, and sacrifice. Terms such as holy sacrifice for the emperor or total devotion to the nation were ubiquitous. This propaganda reached every stratum of the population and created a collective awareness of the need for military expansion and readiness for war. Social control was also supported by strict laws and surveillance systems. Censorship, repression against opponents of the military, and the regulation of work and leisure activities ensured that all areas of life were geared towards war. Even cultural events and religious practices were instrumentalized to spread the messages of war and ideologically mobilize the population. Education played a special role. Schools, universities, and cadre schools taught not only science and technology, but also ideological content. Children and young people learned early on that loyalty to the emperor, sacrifice, and military discipline were central values. The indoctrination created generations willing to stand up for Japan's nationalist and military goals. In summary, Japan in the years before and during World War II was a highly mobilized society. The economy, industry, education, and culture were geared towards war, while propaganda and ideological control brought the population into line. This large-scale mobilization was a decisive factor in Japan's military successes in the early stages of the Pacific War, but it also led to enormous human and social costs that weighed heavily on the country and its people until the end of the war. In the next chapter, we'll look at Japan and the Axis powers, how the country organized its relations with Germany and Italy, signed the Tripartite Pact, and laid down the international war strategy in the context of World War II.
Chapter 8: Japan and the Axis powers. Japan's relationship with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, was a crucial component of Japan's war strategy in World War II. It was characterized by pragmatic military and geopolitical considerations, ideological commonalities, and long-term expansionist goals in Asia and the Pacific. Japan sought both international legitimacy and strategic support for its imperial ambitions in this alliance. The first contacts between Japan and Germany were established as early as the 1920s, but it was not until the 1930s and the growing conflict with Western powers that relations intensified. In the course of the National Socialist seizure of power from 1933 onwards, Germany had pursued an expansive, militarily aggressive program and was looking for partners who could support its global ambitions. Japan, on the other hand, sought to secure resources, raw materials, and strategic positions in Asia. These mutual interests led to closer political and military relations. An important step was the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, which was initially directed against the Soviet Union. Germany and Japan committed each other to fighting communist expansion. Italy joined in 1937, which laid the foundation for the Axis coalition. This pact not only served military interests, but also had symbolic significance. Japan was recognized as an equal partner, and the alliance gave the impression of a global Axis power that wanted to challenge the world order. However, relations with Germany and Italy were not entirely harmonious.
Japan was primarily focused on controlling East Asia and the Pacific, while Germany and Italy focused on Europe and North Africa. Strategic differences meant that coordination between the Axis powers was often uncoordinated, and that Japan acted independently on many issues. Nevertheless, the alliance served Japan as a diplomatic and military counterweight to the USA, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. A highlight of the cooperation was the Tripartite Pact of September 1940, which formally united Japan, Germany, and Italy into a military alliance. The pact stated that an attack on one member state would be considered an attack on all, an attempt to intimidate the US, Britain, and other powers and legitimize Japan's territorial expansion in Southeast Asia. At the same time, the pact gave Japan the assurance that Germany and Italy would not leave it alone on strategic issues. The alliance also influenced Japan's strategic planning. Japan realized that war against Western colonial powers was inevitable if it wanted to expand its resource base. Raw materials such as oil, rubber, and metals from Southeast Asia were essential for the war economy. Access to operation gave Japan a certain tactical self-confidence, enabled diplomatic maneuvers, and increased pressure on Western powers, especially the United States, to act or react. Ideologically, the Axis powers were united by a mixture of nationalism, militarism, and anti-communist attitudes. Japan used this ideological proximity to justify its own aggressive expansion and to legitimize military engagement abroad. While the Axis powers were fighting in Europe, Japan considered control of East Asia and the Pacific to be its natural zone of influence, which laid the groundwork for the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent invasion of Southeast Asia. In summary, relations with Germany and Italy gave Japan not only political legitimacy, but also strategic advantages. Axis cooperation enabled Japan to intensify its expansionist drive, prepare for war against Western colonial powers, and consolidate its own military position in East Asia. At the same time, she showed the limits of the alliance. Different areas of interest, lack of coordination, and pragmatic self-interest characterized the relationship. In the next chapter, we will analyze the attack on Pearl Harbor, the event that directly involved Japan in the global Second World War and ushered in the Pacific War.
Chapter 9. Attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, marked a turning point in the history of World War II and catapulted Japan onto the global stage of conflict. For Japan, the attack was not a spontaneous event, but the result of years of strategic planning, economic necessity, and military conviction that only a preemptive strike against the United States could secure its expansionist policy in Asia. The basis for the operation was Japan's need for raw materials. Expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific was directly linked to control of oil, rubber, metals, and agricultural products. The USA, Great Britain, and the Netherlands tried to prevent Japan from further expansion through economic sanctions, especially oil embargoes. For Japan, this posed an existential threat. Without oil, the Navy would be unable to act, the Army would lose its combat capability, and the entire expansion plan would collapse. Planning for Pearl Harbor began months earlier. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet, designed a complex operation designed to surprise and incapacitate the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Yamamoto was aware of the risks. The attack would drag the U.S. into war. At the same time, he believed that a quick and devastating blow would buy Japan time to consolidate its position in Asia before the U.S. could respond to full war readiness. On the morning of December 7, 1941, more than 350 Japanese planes attacked from 6 aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor, bombing battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and airfields. Within a few hours, the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, and numerous other warships sank or were severely damaged. More than 2,400 U.S. soldiers and civilians died, thousands were injured. The destruction of the naval base was a tactical success for Japan, but the strategic effect was limited. Aircraft carriers, which later played a decisive role in the Pacific War, were not in port and remained undamaged. The attack had immediate and long-term consequences. Politically, he triggered the United States declaration of war on Japan, bringing the United States directly into World War II. This fundamentally changed the global dynamics of the war.
Japan had extended a regional conflict in East Asia to a global war. The American war machine, which had previously remained partially neutral, was now mobilized, industrialized, and geared toward war in the Pacific. In Japan, the attack was propagated socially as a heroic act. The population was sworn by the media and state propaganda to the idea that Japan was fulfilling a historic mission in the fight against the imperialist Western powers. The emperor was stylized as a divine figure, and the attack on Pearl Harbor was hailed as a sign of courage and strategic wisdom. This ideological mobilization contributed decisively to motivating the Japanese population and the military leadership for the long and costly war that followed. Militarily, the attack initially offered Japan decisive advantages. The U.S. fleet was weakened, and Japan was able to start its offensive in Southeast Asia almost unhindered. Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and other colonies fell quickly. But the long-term consequences were serious. The war against the USA became a total war on a global scale, and the resources of the island state would not be sufficient to win the war in the long run. In summary, the attack on Pearl Harbor was the result of strategic planning, economic necessity, and ideological conviction. It showed Japan's determination to pursue its expansionist goals, but at the same time opened the door for an escalation into a global war. Pearl Harbor was tactically brilliant but strategically risky, a decision that would push Japan to the limits of its power in the years to come. In the next chapter, we will analyze the expansion of war in the Pacific, the rapid conquest of Southeast Asia, the occupation of islands and colonies, and the first phase of Japanese expansion in World War II.
Chapter 10: Expansion of War in the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan continued its military expansion at unprecedented speed. The first months of the Pacific War marked a phase in which Japan operated in a seemingly unstoppable offensive, conquering large parts of Southeast Asia, numerous islands in the Pacific, and strategically important colonies. This phase of expansion was the result of months of planning, superior military organization, and the ability to overcome logistical challenges at short notice. Japan took advantage of the initial surprise and weakness of the Western colonial powers that waged the war against Germany in Europe. British, Dutch, and American bases in Asia were ill-prepared for a coordinated attack. Within a few weeks, strategically important points fell: the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, Singapore, and parts of Burma. These conquests secured Japan access to much-needed raw materials such as oil, rubber, tin, and iron, which were essential for the continuation of the war. The capture of Singapore in February 1942 was a symbolic and strategic victory. British troops, considered invincible, were overwhelmed by well-coordinated Japanese land and air operations. The fall of Singapore demonstrated the effectiveness of Japanese tactics, the mobility of the army, and the ability to exploit moral superiority through psychological warfare. Thousands of British soldiers were taken prisoner, and Japanese control over Southeast Asia was secured. At the same time, Japan began to secure control over strategically important island groups in the Pacific. The islands of Guam, Wake, and the Philippines were captured. Airfields were built and supply lines were created, making it possible to carry out major operations deep in the Pacific. The Navy played a central role. Japan was initially able to dominate the sea routes and offer only limited resistance to its opponents. Aircraft carriers and modern naval units allowed for rapid expansion, while supplies were organized by logistics fleets. However, the conquests came at a high organizational price. Japan had to supply over long distances, station troops on islands, and at the same time fight guerrilla actions in China and other occupied territories. The initial superiority provided strategic advantages, but it also led to overstretching and dependence on supply routes, which would later become a crucial problem in the course of the war. Ideologically, the expansion was legitimized by propaganda. Japan presented itself as the liberator of Asia from Western colonial powers, while the population in the occupied territories was portrayed as inferior and controllable. This propaganda served to legitimize the occupation, to mobilize Japanese troops, and to maintain control over the conquered territories.
In summary, the expansion of war in the Pacific demonstrates Japan's ability to combine initial military superiority, strategic planning, and ideological mobilization. The conquest of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and colonial possessions gave Japan resources and influence, but at the same time, a critical dependence on long supply lines. This phase set the stage for the later turning points of the Pacific War, especially the decisive battles like Midway, which were to shift the balance of power in favor of the Allies. In the next chapter, we will analyze the Battle of Midway and the turning point in the Pacific War, Japan's first major defeat that permanently changed the strategic balance. Chapter 11: Battle of Midway and Turning Point in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 is considered the decisive turning point in the Pacific War. By then, Japan had expanded almost inexorably, but Midway showed that despite the initial blows at Pearl Harbor and the loss of smaller colonies, the American Navy was capable of changing the course of the war. This battle was not only a military battle, but also a symbol of Japan's transition from strategic initiative to strategic defensiveness. Japan planned to capture Midway, a remote island in the Central Pacific, in order to secure its dominance in the region and decisively weaken the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The capture of Midway was intended to consolidate control of the Central Pacific and serve as a starting point for further operations against Hawaii. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who led the planning of the operation, was aware that victory was crucial to securing Japanese expansion, but failure could have catastrophic consequences. However, the U.S. Armed Forces had received crucial information about the planned operation by deciphering Japanese radio messages. This precise knowledge allowed the United States to organize a prepared defense and plan an ambush. Aircraft carriers such as the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown were strategically positioned to intercept the Japanese attack. From 4 to 7 June 1942, there was an intense battle. Japanese aircraft attacked Midway, while U.S. carrier aircraft attacked Japanese carriers. The result was devastating for Japan. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk, along with hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots. The U.S. lost a carrier, the USS Yorktown, and some aircraft, but the strategic loss for Japan was catastrophic. The Battle of Midway fundamentally changed the strategic balance in the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was forced to switch from offensive expansion to defensive stance. The losses of experienced pilots, ships, and material could not be replaced in the short term, while the U.S. used its industrial capacity to quickly produce replacements and raise troops. Midway also had psychological effects. The Japanese military had previously believed that its superiority was unchallenged. The loss shattered this illusion and led to a more cautious, defensive warfare. At the same time, the battle strengthened the self-confidence of the Allies, who now recognized that Japan was defeatable. The battle also showed the importance of intelligence, logistics, and air warfare. The U.S. ability to decipher Japanese plans combined with strategic use of aircraft and carriers to create a decisive advantage. For Japan, this was a lesson that was not fully implemented. Overstretching, undervaluing the opponent, and a lack of flexibility characterized the subsequent decisions. In summary, the Battle of Midway marked the turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time, Japan lost decisive military initiative, suffered material and psychological losses, and had to go on the defensive. The Allies thus gained the opportunity to systematically push back the war in the Pacific and to plan strategic offensives that would eventually stop and reverse Japanese expansion. In the next chapter, we will continue to delve deeper into the war in China and Southeast Asia, the fighting in occupied territories, the guerrilla actions, the Japanese administration, and the impact on civilians and resources. Chapter 12: War in China and Southeast Asia. While Japan initially achieved rapid successes in the Pacific, the war also led to a protracted, costly conflict on the Asian mainland. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937, developed into a grueling guerrilla war that put a considerable strain on Japan and tied up resources that were later urgently needed in the Pacific War. At the same time, Japan extended its control to Southeast Asia in order to secure strategically and economically important resources. In China, Japan fought against a combination of nationalist troops under Chiang Kai-shek and communist partisans under Mao Zedong. The Japanese army operated in a constant field of tension. Large cities such as Nanking, Shanghai, or Wuhan were quickly conquered, but control over rural areas was extremely difficult. Guerrilla actions, acts of sabotage, and the support of the population for resistance forces prevented complete submission. Japan relied on brutal measures. Repression, executions, forced labor, and punitive actions against civilians were intended to break resistance, but in the long term led to growing hatred and strong hostility. The logistical challenges in China were immense. The supply over long distances, the securing of occupied territories, and the preservation of combat power on the mainland tied up millions of soldiers and large quantities of material. This led to overstretching, which later weakened Japan in the Pacific War, as resources could not be effectively distributed between China and the newly conquered Southeast Asian colonies. At the same time, Japan conquered Southeast Asia at high speed. Regions such as Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines were occupied, often in coordination with attacks by the Japanese Navy. These conquests secured access to vital raw materials: oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, rubber plantations, rice fields, and strategic ports. The Japanese administration relied on puppet governments, local collaboration, and a mixture of military force and pragmatic control to make maximum use of resources. The occupation policy was characterized by harshness and efficiency. Resistance was punished with draconian measures, civilians had to provide labor and raw materials, and infrastructure was geared to the needs of the Japanese war economy. At the same time, Japan propagated its role as the liberator of Asia from Western colonial rule, an ideology used to ideologically influence the local population and minimize resistance. However, the fighting in China and Southeast Asia also had strategic limits. The Japanese army was forced to divide its troops in order to have a presence both in China and in the new colonies. This led to bottlenecks in material, ammunition, and personnel. In addition, the resistance, especially in China, was never completely broken. This made Japan vulnerable in the later phase of the Pacific War, as resources could not be flexibly shifted between the fronts. In summary, the war in China and Southeast Asia demonstrated Japan's military strength and organizational capabilities, but at the same time showed the limits of expansion. Guerrilla warfare, logistical challenges, and the need to control far-flung areas tied up resources and weakened Japan's combat capability in the long run. At the same time, expansion secured access to raw materials that were crucial to the start of the Pacific War and established Japan as the dominant military power in East and Southeast Asia. In the next chapter, we will examine the Allied counteroffensive and strategic bombing, the phase in which the Allies began to push back the Japanese advance and tip the balance in the Pacific.
Chapter 13: Allied counteroffensive and strategic bombing. From 1943 onwards, the Allies began to systematically push back the Japanese advance. After initial successes in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japan was increasingly reliant on the defensive, as the industrial and military superiority of the United States, Great Britain, and Australia came into play. The Allied counteroffensive combined land, sea, and air operations, marking a period in which Japan not only suffered military setbacks, but also came under increasing strategic pressure. A central aspect was the island-hopping strategy of the USA. Instead of attacking every Japanese position head-on, the Allies concentrated on strategically important islands that served as a starting point for further operations. Islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Mariana Islands were targeted to disrupt Japanese supply routes and gain control of the Central Pacific. This tactic weakened the Japanese defense, as troops and resources were spread across a variety of fronts, and the logistical burden increased. The role of the American Navy and Air Force was decisive. Carrier-based airstrikes destroyed Japanese aircraft and ships before they could even be brought into position.
Battles such as those of Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943, and Leyte Gulf, 1944, showed that Japan no longer had the ability to conduct offensive operations on a broad front. At the same time, strategic bombing hit Japanese cities and infrastructure, undermining both production and morale. The bombing of cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe led to massive destruction. In particular, the firestorm attacks in the spring of 1945 showed the vulnerability of Japanese cities to air raids. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died, while residential and industrial areas were almost wiped out. These strategic bombings served not only to destroy the physical population, but also to psychologically destabilize the population and the military leadership. Parallel to the air offensive, the Allies relied on naval operations to disrupt supply lines. Submarine attacks, naval blockades, and the destruction of cargo ships led to critical shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition. Japan, which was dependent on imports from conquered territories, became increasingly isolated. The combined effect of air raids, naval operations, and island gains led to a gradual erosion of Japan's war capability. The social impact was serious. Civilians and soldiers experienced increasing deprivation, hunger, and fear. Propaganda continued to try to maintain the belief in victory, but awareness of the military situation led to growing exhaustion and resignation. The Japanese totalitarian system began to crumble as the burdens of resource scarcity, casualties, and air raids could no longer be compensated. In summary, the Allied counteroffensive marked the phase in which the strategic initiative passed from the Japanese military to the Allies. Island hopping, air raids, and naval operations weakened Japan materially and psychologically, while control over resources and supply lines was increasingly lost. This phase prepared the ground for the last decisive events of the Pacific War, especially the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the next chapter, we will analyze the situation of Japanese society under the pressure of war in more detail. How mobilization, propaganda, rationed resources, and daily struggle for survival shaped people's lives.
Chapter 14: Japanese Society Under War Pressure. With the expansion of the Pacific War and the increasing counteroffensive of the Allies, Japanese society came under enormous pressure from 1943 onwards. The war became a total war that no longer only involved the soldiers at the front, but the entire population. The economy, labor, morale, and social structures were completely geared towards the war effort, a situation that drastically changed people's lives and claimed enormous victims. The economy was completely focused on the war. Industrial production, agriculture, and raw material extraction were centrally controlled to supply the army and navy. Factories worked around the clock, women and youth were involved in production, and workers had to adapt flexibly to the needs of the military. Imported raw materials, especially oil, rubber, and metals, were increasingly scarce as the Allies successfully blocked supply lines. This led to rationed food, limited energy supplies, and a drastic reduction in living standards. The mobilization of the population took place through propaganda, indoctrination, and social pressure. The government and the military relied on a combination of ideology and control. Schools, media, and cultural institutions reinforced the message of loyalty to the emperor, sacrifice for the nation, and Japan's superiority. Every citizen was seen as part of the war effort, from farmers to factory workers. The youth in particular were prepared for military discipline and ideological conformity, whether through paramilitary exercises, labor service, or compulsory school programs. Social control was closely linked to this mobilization. Resistance to the government, the military, or the war aims was suppressed. Censorship, surveillance, and arrests prevented criticism. At the same time, social tensions arose. The inequality between urban and rural areas, the burden of labor service and rationing, and the increasing involvement of women in production and supply tasks led to conflicts that could only be partially compensated for by propaganda or social norms. Rationing and deprivation shaped daily life. Foods such as rice, meat, oil, and sugar were strictly rationed, and the population had to find creative solutions to alleviate hunger. Airstrikes on cities also led to fear, destruction, and loss of habitat.
In cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, residents were constantly exposed to threats, while families lost members to the front lines, and at the same time, the supply of the civilian population had to be maintained. The psychological burden was enormous. The constant propaganda gave the impression of heroism and duty, but the ubiquitous death at the front, the losses in bombing raids, and the growing prospect of defeat led to fear, despair, and trauma. Many people had to take on several roles at the same time, as workers, providers, and supporters of the army, which further increased the pressure. In summary, Japanese society under war pressure was strongly mobilized, but at the same time extremely stressed. Economic rationing, work obligations, propaganda, and constant danger shaped people's lives. Total warfare led to every aspect of everyday life being subordinated to war, and prepared the population for the decisive events of the final months of the war, including the devastating bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the next chapter, we will turn to war crimes and international responses, the violence in China, the occupied territories of Southeast Asia, and the diplomatic and moral consequences for Japan.
Chapter 15: War Crimes and International Reactions. World War II brought not only military conflicts, but also systematic acts of violence and war crimes that accompanied Japanese expansion in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. These crimes had both immediate and long-term consequences for the victims, the international perception of Japan, and the post-war order. They showed the dark side of Japanese warfare, which was characterized by ideological justification, military discipline, and ruthless violence. The most famous example is the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. After the capture of the Chinese capital, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians were systematically killed. Women were raped, looting and arson destroyed large parts of the city. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 300,000 people lost their lives. This event marks the brutality of the Japanese occupation policy and is still a central point of reference for historical memory and international criticism of Japan. Japanese troops also committed numerous crimes in the occupied territories of Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, Burma, Indonesia, and Malaysia, forced labor, torture, executions, and systematic mistreatment were used to secure control and maintain the war economy. Millions of civilians had to work, transport, and care for them in extreme conditions, often at the risk of their lives. Death, hunger, and disease were omnipresent. Another part of Japanese warfare was the use of military research on humans. The notorious units, such as Unit 731 in Manchukuo, conducted experiments on prisoners for biological, chemical, and medical studies. These human experiments were inhumane, cruel, and led to the death of thousands of victims. Even after the end of the war, the international investigation of these crimes remained complicated, as political interests often hindered publication or prosecution. The international community's reactions to these crimes have been mixed. While the Allies received individual reports of massacres and forced labor during the war, access to comprehensive information was often limited. It was only after the war that trials, such as the International Military Tribunals for the Far East, Tokyo trials, led to leading Japanese military and politicians being held accountable for war crimes. These trials made the dimension of Japanese war crimes public and set a precedent for international prosecution. Politically, the war crimes had long-term consequences. They led to tensions between Japan and its neighboring countries, especially China, South Korea, and the Philippines. Diplomatic relations were strained for decades, and debates about compensation, a culture of remembrance, and historical responsibility continue to shape the region today. There were also controversies within Japan about the recognition and reappraisal of the crimes, some of which were considered nationalist or revisionist. Japanese war propaganda had tried to justify the violence during the war. The occupation of Asia was presented as liberation from Western colonial rule. In practice, however, there was an extreme discrepancy between ideology and reality. The brutal reality of war, forced labor, massacres, and mistreatment of the population led not only to human suffering, but also to long-term damage to Japan's image.
In summary, Japan's war crimes were systematic, brutal, and far-reaching. They influenced military effectiveness, shaped the world's perception of Japan, and had lasting political and diplomatic consequences. While Japan achieved short-term success through subjugation and resource extraction, these crimes left deep scars in the region, setting in motion international norms and processes that would prosecute war crimes and human rights violations in the future. In the next chapter, we will analyze the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the decisive events that forced Japan to surrender and marked the end of the Pacific War. Chapter 16: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 marked the dramatic end of the Pacific War and the culmination of the destructive power of the Second World War. The atomic bombings were the result of decades of research, strategic war planning, and the United States' decision to force Japan to surrender with maximum pressure. For Japan, they meant not only military defeat, but also a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Hiroshima was the target of the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on August 6, 1945. The city, an important military and industrial center, was almost completely destroyed. Within seconds, about 70,000 people died, and tens of thousands more were injured. Heat, pressure waves, and radiation led to immediate destruction of entire neighborhoods. Many victims did not die immediately, but in the days and weeks that followed from radiation sickness, burns, and organic failure. Just 3 days later, on August 9, Nagasaki, also an industrial center, was hit. Here, about 40,000 people died immediately. Many more suffered serious injuries. The psychological effect of the two attacks was as devastating as the physical destruction. Japan was now faced with the impossibility of continuing the war. The military infrastructure was partially destroyed, the morale of the population was broken, and the prospect of a complete capture of the country by Allied troops became increasingly realistic. The decision to use the atomic bombs was strategically justified by the U.S. government under President Harry S. Truman. The aim was to end the war quickly and avoid an invasion of mainland Japan, which would have claimed millions more victims. At the same time, the demonstration of the new weapons technology was also intended to send a political message to the Soviet Union and influence the future geopolitical situation in Asia. For Japan, the situation was existential. Emperor Hirohito personally intervened to bring about the end of the war. On August 15, 1945, he announced the surrender of Japan in a radio address, which was formally signed on September 2, 1945. This ended World War II in the Pacific and marked Japan's transition from an aggressive conquering state to a country under Allied occupation. The humanitarian consequences of the atomic bomb attacks were catastrophic. Over 100,000 people died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered long-term damage from radiation, burns, and disease. Cities, infrastructure, and industry lay in ruins. Japanese society, already heavily burdened by 4 years of total war, faced an existential challenge: surviving, rebuilding, and coming to terms with a traumatic event. Strategically, the use of atomic bombs also had an impact on the post-war order. Japan was forced to reorganize itself under Allied control. The end of the war meant not only political and territorial transformation, but also social, economic, and cultural reorientation. The bombing raids became a symbol of the power of modern weapons technology and of the necessity of international security rules in the nuclear age. To sum up, Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's immediate surrender, ended the Pacific War, and left profound humanitarian, social, and political scars. They were the result of an escalation of the war, combined with technological developments and strategic decisions that were to leave a lasting mark on the history of Japan and the world. In the next chapter, we will examine Japan's surrender and Allied occupation, the period in which Japan was demilitarized, politically and socially restructured, and which laid the foundation for modern Japan. Chapter 17: Surrender and Occupation of Japan. After the devastating atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the military superiority of the Allies, Japan's surrender in September 1945 was inevitable. The formal signing of the surrender on September 2, 1945 on the battleship USS Missouri marked the end of World War II in the Pacific. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Japanese history, the Allied occupation led by the United States, which not only demilitarized the country, but also initiated fundamental political, social, and economic reforms. The terms of surrender were clear. Japan had to completely relinquish its military power, withdraw all occupying troops, and grant the Allies unrestricted access to strategic resources and infrastructure. Japanese leadership, including Emperor Hirohito, formally remained, but was reduced to symbolic and moral authority, while the actual political control rested with General Douglas MacArthur, the commander-in-chief of the Allied occupation. One of the central aspects of the occupation was demilitarization. The Japanese army and navy were completely disbanded, arms production stopped, and weapons depots destroyed. Officers were dismissed or interned, while military leaders were held accountable for their role in the war before military tribunals, the so-called Tokyo trials. This demilitarization was aimed not only at immediate security, but also at laying the foundation for a peaceful Japan that could no longer initiate future aggression. Politically, MacArthur initiated democratization and constitutional reform. In 1947, the Japanese post-war constitution came into force, reducing the imperial office to a symbolic role, introducing separation of powers, and guaranteeing democratic rights for citizens. Of particular note was Article 9, which denied Japan the right to war and the maintenance of a regular army, a fundamental change from previous militarization. These reforms laid the foundation for a democratic and peaceful Japan that based its foreign policy role on economic strength and diplomatic cooperation. Socially and economically, the occupation was also transformative. Land reforms distributed agricultural land from large landowners to small farmers. The production base was modernized, and education systems were reformed to promote democratic values and critical thinking. Women were given political rights, including the right to vote, for the first time, and society as a whole was liberalized. The changes led to a radical break with the authoritarian, militaristic society of pre-war Japan. The psychological dimension of the occupation was no less significant. The population had to deal with the defeat, the destruction, and the deprivations, but at the same time accept the new order. Propaganda, education, and public communication by the Allies were aimed at building loyalty to the new institutions and promoting understanding of democratic principles. In summary, the surrender and occupation of Japan represented a fundamental transformation. Military power was completely withdrawn, political structures democratized, social rights expanded, and economic foundations reorganized. This period was crucial in building modern Japan, a country that shifted from total warfare and militarism to democracy, economic innovation, and international cooperation. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at the political, economic, and social consequences of the war, how Japan recovered from the trauma of war, and laid the groundwork for its rise as a peaceful economic power.
Chapter 18: Political, Economic, and Social Consequences of the War. World War II left Japan in ruins, physically, politically, economically, and socially. The bombings, the fighting in China and the Pacific, the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the years of popular mobilization had brought the country to the brink of collapse. The post-war period was marked by reconstruction, reforms, trauma, and the need to develop a new self-image as a peaceful nation. Politically, the Allied occupation led to far-reaching changes. The Democratic Constitution of 1947 created the basis for parliamentary democracy, the separation of powers, and the restriction of the role of emperor to a symbolic function. Article 9 prohibited Japan from waging war or maintaining a regular army, thus breaking the militaristic tradition once and for all. At the same time, political parties, trade unions, and civil society organizations were supported to enable the participation of the population in the shaping of the state. Economically, Japan was in a catastrophic state after 1945. Cities, industrial plants, and infrastructure were in ruins, raw materials and energy sources were scarce, and the population suffered from hunger and poverty.
Nevertheless, the reforms of the occupation, especially land reforms, the distribution of agricultural land to small farmers, and the support of industrial projects laid the foundation for the later economic rise. Allied control of key industries and the introduction of modern administrative structures helped to gradually restore production capability. Socially, the situation was just as complex. Millions of people had lost loved ones, cities had been destroyed, and the psychological consequences of the war were profound. The population had to live in a completely changed society in which militarism and total obedience no longer prevailed. Women gained political rights for the first time, education was reformed, and the population was increasingly shaped by the principles of democratic participation and civic responsibility. International relations also changed fundamentally. Japan became a peaceful state under the supervision of the United States, but the bond with the United States also created dependencies, especially military and economic. Japan had to redefine its foreign policy. Not expansion, but economic cooperation and diplomacy became the maxim. The memory of war crimes, defeat, and occupation also shaped relations with neighboring countries, especially China and South Korea, for decades. However, the combination of political restructuring, economic modernization, and social transformation prepared Japan for a rapid resurgence. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan developed into a stable democracy and later into a global economic superpower. The lessons of war and occupation, caution against militarism, emphasis on technology, education, and cooperation became the foundation of Japan's new self-image. In summary, the consequences of the Second World War were profound and multi-layered for Japan. Political structures were democratized, the economy was geared towards peaceful production, society was reformed, and the country was repositioned internationally. This transformation laid the foundation for modern Japan, which rose from the rubble of war, expanded economically, and established itself as a peaceful, democratic nation. In the next chapter, we will look at the Japanese culture of remembrance and the commemoration of the war, how society and the state processed the war, reflected on trauma, heroism, and guilt, and shaped memory politically and culturally.
Chapter 19: Japanese Culture of Remembrance and Commemoration. After World War II, Japan faced not only physical and political reconstruction, but also the challenge of shaping the collective memory of the population. War experiences, loss, trauma, war crimes, and the atomic bomb attacks left deep traces that manifested themselves in culture, politics, and public memory. The way Japan remembered the war influenced not only national identity, but also international relations, especially with China, Korea, and the United States. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the occupation by the United States shaped narratives of guilt, responsibility, and pacifism. The emperor was reduced to a symbolic role, militarism was banned, and the population was educated in democratic principles. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the central symbol of the tragedy of war and the horror of nuclear violence. Schools, museums, and memorials began to address these events, creating a collective awareness of the dangers of war and violence. At the same time, the commemoration of the war was complex and often contradictory. Many former soldiers and family members felt pride in the commitment and sacrifice, while at the same time, the destruction and suffering remained unmistakable. In public culture, films, novels, plays, and memoirs were created that addressed both heroism and victim perspectives. Works such as Grave of the Fireflies or historical documentaries reflected the human costs of war and shaped the collective memory of death, hunger, and destruction. Politically, the memory of the war had international dimensions. Conflicts with neighboring states arose mainly due to different interpretations of the Japanese occupation in China and Korea. While in Japan, the focus was often on victims and national tragedy, the neighboring states remembered above all Japanese aggression, massacres, and forced labor. These different perspectives led to ongoing tensions and debates about historical responsibility, compensation, and education policy. Culturally, a mixture of mourning, reflection, and national self-understanding was established. Commemorations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, as well as other local war memorials, commemorated the victims and called for peace. Schools increasingly taught pacifist values, while the media reported on war experiences and reflected on the nation's responsibility. At the same time, there were conservative currents that heroized the war or relativized responsibility, an area of tension that is still noticeable in Japan today. The Japanese culture of remembrance shows how profoundly war experiences can shape societies. It combines individual traumas, national identity, and international politics. Collective memory was used to promote pacifism, to sensitize society to international cooperation, and at the same time, to critically reflect on its own history. This memory shaped modern Japan, influencing educational content, cultural productions, and the country's foreign policy positioning. In summary, the commemoration of the Second World War in Japan is multi-layered and complex. It combines grief, moral reflection, critical debate, and political narratives. This culture of remembrance has shaped Japanese society, helped come to terms with the war, and defined Japan's role as a peaceful, democratic nation in the world. In the next chapter, we will summarize the lessons of Japan's Second World War, causes, course, effects, and the long-term consequences for politics, society, and international relations.
Chapter 20. Conclusion. Lessons from Japan's Second World War. The Second World War left Japan as a deeply changed country, politically, economically, socially, and internationally. The analysis of the causes, course, and consequences reveals a number of key lessons that are important not only for Japan itself, but for the entire international community. These lessons range from assessing expansion, militarism, and ideology to questions of moral responsibility, reconstruction, and sustainable peacekeeping. One of the central lessons concerns the dangers of uncontrolled militarism and expansionism. In the decades leading up to the war, Japan was characterized by a military hierarchy that dominated politics and by ultra-nationalist ideology that justified expansion as a natural mission. The consequences were catastrophic: millions of deaths, destruction, economic impoverishment, and international isolation. For the post-war period, this shows the need to tie military power to democratic control mechanisms and to reconcile national ambitions with international law and multilateral institutions. Another lesson concerns the role of resource dependence and economic planning. Japan's need to secure oil, rubber, metals, and food from conquered territories was a key driver of expansion. At the same time, logistical overstretching proved to be a weak point. The war illustrates how economic constraints influence military decisions and how crucial sustainable economic infrastructure is to ensure political stability. The humanitarian costs and war crimes teach the importance of moral responsibility and the rule of law. The Nanjing Massacre, forced labor, experiments on people, and the treatment of the civilian population are cautionary examples of the consequences of dehumanization in war. The international response, especially the Tokyo trials, shows that accountability and criminal justice are crucial to prevent future violence and establish international law. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki illustrate the extreme risks of technological escalation. They show that the combination of military power, political calculation, and technological progress can lead to decisions that cause not only military but also humanitarian disasters. The lesson is the need for international control over weapons of mass destruction and the political imperative to resolve conflicts not through escalation but through diplomacy and preventive measures. Politically and socially, Japan's post-war period offers important lessons in reform, democratization, and social reconstruction. The occupation and the introduction of democratic structures, demilitarization, and social reforms made a peaceful new beginning possible. Japan shows that even after extreme destruction, political transformation, education, the rule of law, and international cooperation can enable long-term peace and stability. Finally, the war also teaches the importance of collective memory and remembrance culture.
The confrontation with trauma, guilt, victimhood, and responsibility shapes national identity and foreign policy. Japan's remembrance work, which includes memorials, education, and public discussions, is a central mechanism to reflect on historical mistakes and raise awareness for future generations. In summary, World War II in Japan shows a dramatic chain of choices, ideologies, and circumstances. Expansion, military aggression, resource dependence, ideological mobilization, and international isolation led to enormous human and material losses. However, the post-war period and subsequent reforms demonstrate that societal resilience, political foresight, and international cooperation can create the basis for recovery, peace, and prosperity. Japan remains a striking example for world history. The combination of political mismanagement, military overextension, and ideological radicalization can have catastrophic consequences. But at the same time, post-war developments show that transformation, responsibility, and peaceful cooperation make the way out of destruction possible. The lessons of Japan's Second World War remain relevant for politics, society, international relations, and for understanding the mechanisms that influence war and peace. This ends the 20-chapter script about Japan in World War II, fluently written and detailed from the causes to the war to the post-war period and the long-term lessons.